button here. So I want to just begin by acknowledging that we are delivering this webinar from the traditional homelands, past and present, of the Lenape people. And I should introduce myself first. My name is Lucy Cummings. I am the Senior Manager of Faith Sector Resilience at New York Disaster Interfaith Services, or NYDIS, as we refer to ourselves. NYDIS is a not-for-profit faith-based federation, and we have a membership of over 60 diverse faith traditions and religious bodies and philanthropies. And our network is larger. It's comprised of over 2,000 faith-based organizations, which include religious schools and religious charities. And we also work with more than 5,000 houses of worship, and that includes 16,000 clergy and lay leaders. So it's a big network, and we work alongside the New York City Emergency Management and public health emergency agencies to together provide wraparound disaster readiness, response, and recovery services to New York City's faith sector and also to under-resourced New Yorkers impacted by crises. So why are we an Interfaith Disaster Services Network focusing on climate resilience? Well, to begin with, climate degradation is one of the main drivers of disasters in New York City, whether we're talking about flooding, extreme heat, air quality, and more recently, perhaps, or consistently, I should say, when we're talking about the increasing number of people fleeing climate disasters who are seeking refuge in New York City. It is a vital and increasingly important social justice issue. And all of us on the call will know that when we're talking about climate, we're talking about a crisis that is disproportionately impacting disinvested communities. In New York City, 56% of residents live within or directly, let me rephrase that. 56 of New York City residents who live within or directly adjacent to floodplains identify as non-white, and more than half of these floodplain residents live in areas considered low income. During Hurricane Ida last year, as most of us know, most of those killed during that hurricane drowned in their basements. And because, again, as we know, basements are often the most affordable or the only affordable option for working poor and undocumented people. And houses of worship are on the front lines of this. 1/3 of New York City houses of worship are located in flood zones, and often these houses of worship are the ones who provide most of the social safety net programs for the communities in which they're serving. So, and climate is a threat multiplier. It's worsening economic and health vulnerabilities across the city. Finally, this is not going away. We're seeing the severity and the frequency of climate disasters increasing. And while our city has some of the best in the world climate forecasting, when you're talking about climate vulnerabilities and our need to prepare to address these vulnerabilities, New York is way behind. So we need to start preparing now, developing adaptive strategies now, and if we don't, the impacts will be much worse. So this series is about helping New York City religious leaders prepare for and build resilience to our climate emergency. I also want to thank FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Bricks and Mortals, and New York State voluntary organizations active in disasters, New York State VOAD. They are partnering with us to deliver this series. So today, we are focusing on emotional and spiritual care for those struggling with climate anxiety. Many of us, I would say myself included, don't have a lot of experience in providing pastoral care to the growing numbers, and especially young people who are really grappling with grief over the climate emergency and ecological destruction more generally. And I'm delighted that today we have an incredible speaker, Nobuko Hori, and she is bringing a really deep experience to this topic, both as a frontline climate activist, a Zen Buddhist, and an emotional care provider professionally. That is also what she does. And I'm also really excited because for those of you who have joined us for previous webinars, there have been a lot of facts. And today we are going to take a more emotional journey, and Nobuko is going to bring an experiential and deeply personal approach to the topic. And that certainly will help all of us in terms of building our own empathy towards this issue. So without further ado, let me pass the reins over to Nobuko.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that introduction, for having me here. It's a real honor to be with you all. Before I start the presentation, I actually I know, for a lot of you might be your lunch hour, maybe some of you are even on the road. If you are able to come off camera, I have a few questions because I really wanted to get a sense of like, who's here in the room. I have a few questions. If you could like raise your hand or use the raise hand function in the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, I would super appreciate it. And if not, but basically, I just wanted to get a sense of, so how many of you here are clergy, educators, therapists, or someone who works with in a climate related field? You could just raise your hand or use the raise hand function. Okay, I see a few hands raised. Great. How many of you have been directly impacted by a climate change related weather event? Yeah, few hands for sure. How many of you experience climate crisis related anxiety? Yeah, a lot of hands. How many of you have been involved in racial, social, or climate justice related efforts? Yeah, a good amount, probably the same number of hands. That's great. Just last two, how many of you have young people or anyone in your life whose life has been altered by the climate crisis? That means like making a change of direction in your life path, etc. Yeah, definitely several hands. And then how many of you are that person whose life has been altered by the climate crisis? Definitely a few hands. Thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to get a sense of like where people are at. That's really helpful. I'll just say a few more words about myself before I get started. As Lucy said, I'm a longtime Zen Buddhist practitioner, and I've done some clinical pastoral education. In 2017, did a first unit, and I'm actually going to be headed to Union Theological Seminary in their Buddhism Engaged Interreligious Studies program in 2 weeks. So I'm super excited about that. Thank you. So again, super happy to be here with you all. I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen in just a second. Basically, how this will go is I'm going to try to actually, so I have a presentation. I was thinking it'd be about 30 minutes. I'm going to try to squeeze it down to like 25, just to leave time for some conversation following. So I might have to go through some of the slides a little bit more quickly. Yay, Union alum. Nice. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. So providing emotional and spiritual care for climate anxiety. You know, when Lucy and I talked about this topic, I kind of felt like just move on to the next. that sometimes the best way to learn to minister someone is to take a walk in their shoes. And just by reading the room before, it seems like a lot of you are already doing that. Like a lot of you already are that person who is grappling with these issues, and, you know, has that experience of, you know, probably being in some related field, whether it's clergy, or maybe you just are trying to be a good listener, a good ally. So it sounds like a lot of us are already, you know, in that path. For today, I wanted to just share a little bit about my journey as, you know, a Zen Buddhist practitioner, and also someone who really pivoted to doing frontlines climate justice work. Just as a way, you know, because if you're not that person who's super familiar, I think it could be helpful to hear what my journey's been like, to really get a sense of, you know, listening and being, you know, feeling what, you know, what a young-ish person, I'm a millennial, not a Gen Z, obviously, but is feeling as it relates to the climate crisis. So now is a time, I'm not here to give you lots of answers, but really just to like share openly so that we can all try to take away something that can open us up to, yeah, to hearing the cries of the world through young people, through our congregations. So just a little bit about my journey, just for fun. I'm someone who's been involved in theater and singing over the years. That on the left is a little production of Pirates of Penzance on the Hoboken waterfront about 10 years ago. On the right side, I've been practicing Zen Buddhism since 2006. 2018 to 2020, I lived in residence at San Francisco Zen Center and practiced at Tassajara Monastery as well. I'm just going to give a little shout out to my friend Zuzu on the left. I'm in the center in that photo. My friend Zuzu actually came with me to line 3, which was a big pipeline resistance movement happening last year. Some of my, you know, earlier ministry, 2013 on, was more related to, you know, human-based efforts. So protests and vigils outside of the Elizabeth Detention Center in New Jersey, racial justice issues, environmentalism, environmental justice. These are I've been aware of since childhood, really, but I think it was easier to connect to what I saw as like human issues, human justice issues. It took me a little while actually to connect the climate crisis with all of these other issues. And as I move into the body of this presentation, I just wanted to take a moment to really appreciate the people who have inspired me and guided me the most on my journey. On the left is Sensei Kriti Kanko. She is a climate scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund. She's a Buddhist teacher of the Boundless Emotion Sangha. She's someone who's been in my life for about 15, almost 16 years as an older sister figure, a mentor and teacher. She's been based in Boulder, Colorado for the last 10 years, where I have also lived in the past. And it was really her work as a Buddhist teacher, really focusing on climate and racial justice issues, that honestly was her leadership and classes that I took with her and personal conversations. That's why I'm involved in the climate movement. In the center, we have Tara Hauska. She's the founder of Indigenous Two-Spirit Queer Femme-Led GNU Collective. She's a tribal lawyer, Anishinaabe Line 3 resistance, climate justice leader. When I was at the Line 3 resistance movement, was part of the resistance camp that she led. And then last but not least on the right is Thich Nhat Hanh. Maybe many of you have heard of him, world-renowned Vietnamese Zen Buddhist teacher who passed away earlier this year. He's really the founder of Engaged Buddhism, was super, was pleading to both the Vietnamese and US governments during the Vietnam War, and has done decades and decades of deep peace and healing and justice work. So I just wanted to acknowledge that many of the concepts, Many of the concepts and slides in this presentation come from my mentor, Kriti Kanko's presentation on the climate crisis that she'll often give to Buddhist sanghas or congregations. Again, she's a climate scientist, Buddhist teacher, and as I said, her role in my life has been the biggest influence on my involvement in the climate movement. So, climate crisis. I know that a number of us in this room have been paying attention, but why is it that it feels like it's such an uphill battle? Like, why is not the whole world paying attention when it seems like, you know, we are on the brink of a 6th mass extinction? Like, shouldn't this be in the forefront of our government solutions, really our social consciousness? My mentor, Kriti, has a hypothesis that maybe it has something to do with trauma. I have a few sort of statistics to read, and so just bear with me, take a deep breath. This is something to think about as in all the spaces that we're in, the grocery stores, work. In North America, 1 in 3 people witness domestic violence. 1 in 4 people have alcoholic relatives. 1 in 4 people have been beaten with marks left on their bodies. 1 in 5 people were molested sexually as a child. These are heavy statistics. These are heavy things to think about and hold. And I'm sharing this because just to say that this trauma, it lives under the surface all the time. And when our individual, our intergenerational, our collective trauma is so much, it's like, how can we take on earth and climate trauma, global climate trauma on top of that? We don't have the healing structures that we need currently to be able to address all of these levels. But we do need to learn how to compost our trauma through both individual and community healing practices in order to face the climate crisis. Whoops. And again, there's no group of non-traumatized people outside of us and our friends that is going to lead us. We need to see each other in our full humanity, which includes our full trauma and also our full capacity for love. And something that Kriti likes to point out is that one-on-one psychotherapy is important, super, super important, and it's not going to be enough to heal the scale of trauma that we have. Collective trauma also needs to be healed through community healing work. And that's why I think it's important to point out the importance of congregational work, community building work. For me, sometimes that's looked like grief circles, and even just the support of deep friendship circles, especially for me in the climate activist movement. I have found that and found it to be super supportive in keeping up this work, which is hard and it's heavy. And also you need those connections to maintain joy. So I'm going to try to quickly move through. I wanted to include some of the climate science, although I think that probably most of you are well familiar with it. I wasn't sure, you know, who would, just where people would be on the call. So I'm going to try to go through this kind of quickly, especially the pieces of it that are pretty well publicized. Sometimes just like sinking into the trauma, like just being aware of kind of the fullness of where our psyches are at, just helps us to like take in that where we really are. But I'm also going to try not to spend too much time here. 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, what does it really mean? And again, this kind of just looks at the differences of 1.5 versus 2. At 1.5 degrees C of warming, 65 million people will be displaced by rising sea levels. At 2 degrees, 80 million people would be displaced. I'm going to jump down and just say at 2 degrees, we would lose 18% of insect species, 16% of plants, and 18% of vertebrates. At 1.5 degrees, you know, this is 1.5 degrees is considered the threshold of where we still have, like, we will lose a lot, but we'll still have a livable planet. We would lose 70 to 90% of all coral reefs. At 2 degrees, we would lose 99%. And again, I'll jump up actually. You know, at 1.5 degrees, at least 14% of people would be exposed to deadly heat waves, I believe annually. At 2 degrees, that number jumps to over 1/3 of the entire Earth's population.
I just wanted to point folks to Maggie Jerry's chat comment around also the linkages to substance use and trauma. But go ahead, Nobuko.
That was because of your alcoholic relatives bullet point. I just wanted to point out that there's a strong link between trauma and having those types of conditions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Maggie. Really appreciate that. Yeah, all of these issues are deeply interconnected. Whoops. Yeah, so in order to avoid global temperature rise above 1.5 degrees C, which is still like a pretty ambitious goal, we need to cut global carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. We don't have a lot of time. We need to bring down carbon emissions to 0% by 2050. I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. The point of this slide is just to demonstrate that there isn't a single tipping point when it comes to climate crisis. There's actually a really complex network of tipping points. And, you know, because some people have said, oh, it's too late. It is technically, and this slide comes from, again, it's pretty widely put out there by various governmental organizations, but basically there are certain tipping points that have tipped. The Arctic ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, there are many that are on the brink. And so this is just to point out that we need to be caring for all of these as they are a deeply interconnected network, but there is not one single tipping point. And I'm going to move on. So thinking about who is most responsible for global carbon emissions, I mean, think about, we have to get that number down to 45%, but does that mean that like we all just drastically reduce our footprint and that's enough? Well, no, obviously we all have different access to resources. So this picture over here from Oxfam just takes a look at, you know, you see here a blue line. This is where our carbon footprint per person needs to be by 2030 in order to meet that, to keep global temperature rise at no higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So at that level, the richest 1% will still be emitting 30 times that amount. A lot of this is luxury emissions, so private jets. I don't know if you guys saw, I forget what her name was, but it was just somebody who was trying to avoid like sitting in 30 to 45 minutes of LA traffic, takes a 9-minute private jet ride. This is actually much more common than we realize. And so who is polluting is very, very disproportionate. The richest 10% is 9 times more than what the average person needs to be emitting. The middle 40%, we get a little bit closer. It's still above that level. That's probably where, you know, the average like working person or maybe, you know, middle-class person who's maybe not traveling like a ton. And then we have the poorest 50%. These are the people in the global south who are emitting the least. And suffer, and also say that, you know, come from cultures that actually give solutions about how to live communally, how to share resources, how to live in harmony with the earth. These are the people who also suffer the most from climate crisis, contribute the least to it. Another piece that I'm not going to spend time on, but this I only learned this last year during COP26. The US military is the #1 global polluting institution, and military emissions are exempt from the Paris Climate Accord. So again, I'm not going to go into this, but basically US military emissions are equal to double the amount of cars in the entire US that are currently on the road. So if you think of the 257 million, million cars on the road. Sorry. I just realized anyway, the point is that US military emissions are extremely, extremely high. And so we need to be thinking beyond just, I need to reduce my footprint, and that's how we're going to get there. There are a lot of forces that go into this. Moving on. Wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about the role of white supremacy and extractive economy in the climate crisis. Again, as we're thinking about this through a justice lens, Black, Indigenous, and people of color globally contribute the least to the climate crisis. They do and will suffer the most. Indigenous people protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. Indigenous people, whether through in the Amazon, across the US, and throughout the world, these traditions know how to keep our forests, our oceans clean, work closely with the land. So yes, Indigenous people make up only a small percentage of the world's population, and yet protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. So this is who, when we think about environmental movement, we owe the environmental movement to hundreds, thousands of years of Indigenous land and water protectors. Black, Indigenous, and people of color have called for financial reparations and are often sidelined in white-led environmental NGOs that, it's important to think about structural, infrastructural solutions, but often we don't think about this justice component, and especially like white-led environmental NGOs, and also think about, who's leading some of these frontline fights, which is often, again, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Cultural and ancestral knowledge has been subjugated. Knowledge of how to live in harmony with the earth has been suppressed and or destroyed through colonization, through hundreds of years of colonization. White supremacy has subjected the bodies of people of color and continues to do so to extract human, animal, plant, and mineral resources for the creation of wealth while killing the planet. Let me just check the chat. Okay, time check, 12:30. I'm going to try to finish up it by like 12:40 if that's okay, and that'll still leave probably about 20 minutes for discussion. Superstorm Sandy, so just to keep it super local, here's a photo of flooding in Red Hook after Superstorm Sandy. Storm surges are more intense with sea level rise. I think you all know that, and you all remember really well. Again, some of the justice component of this, superstorms and Superfund sites, a deadly combination of environmental racism and climate crisis. I don't know how many of you know this, maybe more in this group. Of New York and New Jersey's 198 Superfund, federally designated toxic waste sites, 45 of them are within a half mile of coastal areas vulnerable to storm surge. Why is that so bad? I mean, I think we all know. An example is during Superstorm Sandy, storm surge brought dioxin, which is a highly toxic cancer-causing chemical. It was actually from a former Agent Orange plant in Newark, New Jersey, that has polluted the Passaic River. Storm surge brought that really, really toxic water from the Passaic River into people's homes and basements and flooding, impacting primarily Black and Brown communities. Dioxin was found in people's homes because of storm surge. Future superstorms have a high chance of bringing toxic pollutants from waste sites through storm surge, adding extra layers of harm and damage to frontline communities. So learning about the frightening truths of climate science, how did I respond? I was, for me, this pivot happened in 2020. I was taking a course with Kriti Kanko, the mentor that I've mentioned, and basically learned a lot of these pieces. The course itself was on the intersections of Buddhism, climate, and racial justice. I was sitting with, and again, pandemic, spending a lot of time alone. I had these nightmarish book of revelations, like visions of our earth and, like people that I know, places that I know and love, in fires, drought, floods, climate death. This really shook me at my core. And it really seemed that climate crisis was where I needed to devote my energy. I felt like, I've been involved in other justice issues in the past, but without a livable planet, what home do we have? What is our ground zero? As a Buddhist practitioner, I felt like, the only way to live out my vows is to, we have 4 great vows. The first one is these paradoxes: beings are numberless, I vow to save them. I made this internal vow to devote my energy towards climate justice. And I learned about nonviolent direct action as a theory of change. I became involved in the global climate organization Extinction Rebellion, as well as the indigenous-led Line 3 resistance. And I realized that these frightening truths can only be faced within community to support, uphold, and uplift each other as we join in resistance to systems of extraction and create pockets of joy through life-giving efforts. So in early 2021, I watched a documentary on the Line 3 movement. And when I saw, and I'll just say, so you can see on the left side of the screen, Line 3 is a transnational tar sands oil pipeline under construction through Anishinaabe and Ojibwe territory in Minnesota of last year, threatening to poison hundreds of bodies of water, lakes, and of course the land. That the emissions alone would be the equivalent of 40 new coal-fired power plants or 138 million new cars on the road. Again, we cannot, if we're going to bring down carbon emissions by 45%, we cannot have new fossil fuel infrastructure. We cannot. So Indigenous leaders had been trying for years to fight the system by trying to get, the city, the state to revoke the Enbridge company's permits, which is, by the way, is a Canadian company, and appeal to President Biden also to revoke the permits. When I saw the documentary and I saw these women, these Indigenous women, putting their bodies on the line, bodies that have been historically brutalized for hundreds of years, having the kind of courage to put their bodies on the line, not just for themselves, for their people, but for all of us. I felt like I've never done something like this before, but I can do it too. And I have to, or I want to. And so in getting involved in Extinction Rebellion, actually our Buddhist Sangha, several of us went along with several chapters of Extinction Rebellion, formed an affinity group of 30 to 40 people and went up to Line 3 in June of last year. We took part of the biggest protest to date. Here, I just wanted to show, this was from the day before that protest. There was a large gathering, about 1,000 people gathered during that time. This is like Faith Communities Against Line 3. Here you have like a pretty interfaith group of people who gathered. It was called the Treaty People Gathering during that time of that large protest. That protest was the most powerful day of my life. I had never before seen hundreds of people coming onto a construction site, a pump station, where Line 3 construction was happening, and saying with joy and fierceness, like a sacred no. There were Indigenous people like playing the drums and singing, and literally hundreds of people, young, old, Black, Indigenous, white allies, people of color, disabled, queer, Two-Spirit, folks, like I said, it was the most powerful day of my life. There were some activists. So the photo before was actually at the pump station. This was the access road. There were activists that set up a blockade in the form of a boat to the access road. Here you have a lot more people supporting those efforts. That banner, Relatives Not Resources, comes from the indigenous knowledge that the waters, the plants, they are our relatives who we are in relationship with. They are not resources. This photo just demonstrates some of like the state pushback. This was a helicopter from the Department of Homeland Security that used roto wash. This looks pretty mild in this photo, but basically the helicopter dropped down and spun the propeller really fast, basically forming like a windstorm. And so we couldn't really see for a few minutes while this happened. This must have been just at the beginning because it still looks pretty clear. Just a moment about like, I've been pretty involved in Extinction Rebellion and other related efforts. One piece of work that I love is I'm a co-coordinator of a group of an Extinction Rebellion affinity group called Mindful Rebels. And this is a group of contemplative practitioners. We actually gather outside of BlackRock headquarters. That's the world's largest a financial asset manager, also the largest investor in fossil fuels. We gather outside of their headquarters every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. to sit in prayerful protest. You can see our banner, People Over Profit, Planet Over Profit. And so they were all there this morning and will continue to be. Almost done here. When ministering to someone with climate anxiety or someone who is a climate activist, you may encounter feelings of despair and isolation, fear of bringing a child into a world in crisis, distrust of capitalist systems of extraction causing climate crisis, a lack of motivation towards conventional career paths, interconnected racial, climate, and economic trauma, a desire to affect change by challenging oppressive systems, a desire to create alternative ways of living in community, and maybe a desire for community, but not knowing where to find it. I don't necessarily, so I'm hoping that in the discussion, we can kind of maybe try to think about some of these things together. I don't have a prescribed list of solutions or suggestions, but I definitely can make suggestions to specific questions. And finally, I just wanted to say thank you for being here today, for opening your mind and heart to the climate crisis, for hearing the cries of the world. May our efforts bring justice and healing to this world.
Thank you so much, Nobuko, for that very personal journey. So I will now just open the floor.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, just inviting any reflections that you have, any questions. And if there's nothing bubbling up, I do have some prompts that I can share, but I'll first just leave it open. You can use the raise hand function. Let me pop in. Looks like Maggie raised her hand, her hand.
Oh yeah. I am a she, her. I have it in my little name area. Thank you very much. I mean, this was really powerful. And though I have many friends and many people in my social network who participate in these things, I am not able to. I'm in the federal government and I work for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And I work on climate change. I coordinate our climate change and health equity work within the Department of Health and Human Services. So I'm excited about your presentation. It had a lot of content and it really was moving. So I just want to first honor that and just thank you. And I'm grateful for all moments where I get to be in a space like this, right? And the other reflection that I just wanted to share and that I think would maybe even, I just want to suggest it as something to reflect on as possibility for the presentation, is that the process of what is trauma, like when people hear, well, trauma, well, then what does that look like? Like, what are some of the things that happen to people when they experience trauma? Because part of it is that isolation, and there's some things that happen in the brain and the dissociative behavior. And so knowing that that's part of our society, and that it's not just at the individual level, like you said, the historical trauma, and also the experience, obviously, of forced slavery for African American communities and so on. And then the real harm in our culture and our society broadly, and in North America, I do feel it strongly. But if people can understand, maybe in one slide, an overview of some of the basic characteristics of trauma, and then what are some of the basic characteristics of trauma recovery? Because some of the basic characteristics of trauma recovery align with that community engagement. And I know that in my work, one of the things I'm concerned about, because we do work on suicide prevention, we do work on substance use and mental health, and then I'm looking at the intersection with climate change, is hope. What is the role of hope? How do we operationalize hope? And how do we present the really stark and very, very scary statistics with, as you pointed out, actionable things that we can do collectively and together, right? Even if it's helping one person counts. And I particularly appreciated your point on the Indigenous worldview of the relatives. So even if it's one river counts. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Maggie.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Maggie, for your reflections and also your feedback. That's super valuable. I really appreciate it, because I think, it's so important to I think you touched on what is trauma-informed care. And I think that would definitely be something to explore more, in future versions of this presentation. I can say that, I think like your role in mental health support, services, for folks with addiction is so important. I think, especially movement spaces, frontline spaces, the trauma load, because, my experience is that the people who are moved to join the front lines are the people who are often have a lot of trauma or just feel all of this very, very deeply. And when that's not tended to, and we don't have the skills to tend to it, that can end up being expressed in unhealthy ways. And so I feel like, the role of, your work is so important. And I just hope that, there are ways that we can connect people like you to more of frontline communities, frontline organizations, so that no matter what, role we're in. And I think, and I'm so glad that you spoke up, because I feel like it's super important to highlight, not everyone has the privilege to be able to jump into a frontlines movement. There are definitely different roles, and when you work for the federal government, obviously, if you want to keep your job, you have to be careful about the roles you jump into. And yet there are so many ways to stay connected, and to offer each of our individual gifts and skills to promote healing. So thank you so much for your reflections. I'm wondering, anyone else, before I share a prompt, wondering if anyone else has any reflections or comments that they'd like to share.
Emily, it looks like you turned your sound off. Sound off. So would you like to share? Or Ruth?
It looks like there's a question in the chat from Elizabeth. Elizabeth says, what would you say to people feeling guilty for not doing enough? Sometimes I feel that this guilt can become paralyzing. That's a great question, because I feel like that impacts so many of us. I think that again, orienting towards radical self-care is actually a subversive act. And first, like taking care of our own needs. Like sometimes we don't always have the capacity to be joining frontline efforts, and for whatever reason, you know, school, you know, childcare responsibilities, any number of possibilities, or just time, or we're overwhelmed. And I feel like, you know, the first thing that we can do is just extend like deep, radical self-care, to take care of ourselves. Again, when we live in an extractive economy, I think, you know, oppressive systems want us to feel like we're responsible as individuals, for fixing this climate crisis, and that's not the case. It was created by systems, so it has to be fixed by systems. At least that's just my personal worldview. And so I think, yeah, extending that personal care, and like spaciousness, and then also like, yeah, just being open, when the more that we can be open, to ways of plugging in, like maybe it's just like us, you know, small, like making connections with other people. Maybe I don't know, like some people I know are organizing something. I can't show up. Maybe I can pass out a few flyers, or I can like bake some bread for them or whatever. Just thinking about ways that we can exist within a web instead of within a silo. Looks like there's a few more questions in the chat. Storm says, can you say something about how climate anxiety may be experienced differently by different generations, and muse on what resilience strategies may be appropriate for different generations? Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, I try not to make the generalization that like younger people feel this more heavily. And I do feel that is the case. I think, you know, anyone who's like paying attention will feel that climate anxiety. I think especially Gen Z, you know, generation even younger than myself, as someone who's in my early 30s, definitely I've noticed that people in their early 20s are much more aware of justice issues than even I was at that age. And I think it's because we're seeing storms getting worse and worse, and various climate related weather events. And people are just feeling the heaviness of the world that they're going to be growing up in. I think, I'll be honest, like a response that sometimes I hear kind of in jest is like, oh, you know, you guys got to figure it out. I'm going to be dead by then, you know, like a beloved coworker said that the other day to a teenager. And it upset me a little bit, actually, because I thought, like, you know, these kids should not have to bear the brunt of this. No one person should. And I feel like there's a lot of ways that we can listen to and support each other. I would say that, you know, the more that younger and older people can be open to learning from one another, to forming community and meaningful connections. That's been something that's been really meaningful for me, is like being alongside people in their 60s and 70s and even 80s in this work, as well as people in their early 20s. I learn from people straight out of college all the time, you know, who are like way more educated on this than I am. I hope that in terms of resilience strategies, I feel like I can't highlight enough the importance of building relationships and building community. I know that's pretty broad, but again, that has been what has built resilience for myself. And what I see building resilience for other people is like getting plugged in, building relationships and trust. I think, let's see, Leslie says, there are so many issues and crises to be addressed. If there was one initiative, the newly forming Environment and Technological Cause Disaster Working Group for United Church of Christ Disaster Ministry might focus on, what direction would others recommend we add to our list? Okay. I would say so often in this crisis, we are very solution oriented, which of course is important. And sometimes it's possible that we miss like the connections at the grassroots, like where are these problems stemming from? And again, just take this as my personal orientation towards this, but I do believe that so much of these crises comes from our extractive economy, one that's based on one that has been built upon structural racism and genocide of Indigenous people. These are heavy topics, but I think like having real conversations, learning to talk to each other, learning to have honest conversations, learning to check in and build a culture of care, of like deep radical care. Our organizations, generally speaking, are not built to do that. Or maybe they are, but we can always work on it, right? That's just my personal response to it, addressing these questions and always working on building our culture of care.
Leslie, would you mind putting your email in the chat box so that others perhaps can respond as well? That's such a big question. I would love a chance to reflect a bit, but if you're comfortable with that, please put your email in the chat box.
I will, definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much for your feedback.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah,
Alan, do you have a question? Sorry, I'm looking at the screen and can't tell when people are raising their hands or not. Go ahead, Nobuko.
Yeah, I was just going to read. I mean, Maggie has her hand up and just made a comment that, yeah, it's like regarding what I mentioned about my coworker, like it's really sad, callous, but very likely a coping mechanism, right? For this older person. I will say this person's only in their like early 50s, like.
Well, I don't know. I feel old sometimes. I just want to say for Leslie, because I probably wouldn't write this in an email, given my role, but just broadly, we're looking across all of our disaster work to see if we have policies that are based on an earlier time when disasters were not as frequent and not as long and not as intense. And we're really looking to see if there's been discriminatory practices towards people who were pre-disaster vulnerable, and whether or not the recovery dollars are allowed to support people's lives being improved as part of the recovery. So when you look at those two pieces, I think the VOAD world, I came out of the VOAD world originally, so I was very involved with those types of policies. And so looking at that earlier side of like, is this a disaster caused event or a need that might need to be reworked to really understand underlying social determinants of health and justice? And then is the recovery dollar being spent to really improve the person's life so they'll be better off in the next disaster, more resilient in the next disaster, as opposed to the older mindset, which was not trying to improve people's lives because you don't want to put false expectations. Just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thanks. Mitigation dollars are super important in this.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Maggie. Yeah, again, I think like highlighting like who is impacted and how we can address those disparities. Really appreciate you bringing in very specific ways of addressing Leslie's question.
So we have a couple of minutes left for perhaps a final question, or Nobuko, a final prompt.
Nobuko, could you say something about what spiritual practices Zen Buddhism particularly offers for those responding to climate crisis anxiety?
Yeah. Thank you, Storm. I think that for me, the sitting meditation practice and bearing witness has probably like increased my capacity for compassion for myself, for others, for bearing witness to the world, doing that practice with other people. There is a kind of very like quiet resilience that I think grows when you're in community, doing contemplative practice with other people. I'd have to probably reflect on that one a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, like bringing those contemplative practices into nature and really feeling that relationship, I feel like I've been deeply impacted by Indigenous spirituality that I have learned because of frontline efforts where I was working closely with Indigenous people, learning about relationship, you know, I'm looking at the time. But yeah, learning about relationship and how it's not, you know, nature doesn't exist just for me to enjoy, but like, how can I also be a steward? How can I be in relationship with my environment, even if it's just my room, the plants, the waters, and just feeling, I think we often feel disconnected, really feeling that those being open to and feeling those connections, bringing whatever contemplative practice we have back to the earth.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful way to end our conversation today. And thank you again, Nobuko, for sharing your journey and your insights. This is our last in the summer series of climate resilience webinars, but we will continue through the year. And this is just for me a wonderful reminder to keep space for the spiritual and emotional care that we as faith leaders, whether clergy or lay, that's such an important part of our responsibility in terms of disaster human services. So I'm very grateful for you getting us started, Nobuko. And please, if folks could, two things. If I'm going to put up a poll, if you could give me some feedback on that, on our presentation today, that will be